All right, everyone, welcome back to our first panel of the day, Behind the Force, Origins, and the Future. As I think back to the time period before 2019, it was far from certain whether a Space Force, a Space Corps, or even a U.S. Space Command would be established. I remember being challenged to clearly articulate the problem, as Sarah Monero had mentioned earlier, that a Space Force would solve. There was a tremendous amount of activity, not just what you saw publicly in speeches and hearings and op-eds, but there was a lot happening behind the scenes. It took the efforts of many folks, Chairman Rogers, Ranking Member Cooper, those on our first panel that'll be here, and I'll introduce in a moment, others in the room here today, Sarah Monero, I think J.R. Reardon is here, and even others not able to join us today, Doug Lavero, and many military and civilian staff. So I am really pleased that we were able to assemble this first panel to talk about the Space Force origin story, reflecting on the debates and how it really came to be. And now, 5 years in, is it what the creators envisioned, and where does it go from here? I can think of no one better to guide this conversation. My predecessor here at CSIS, Todd Harrison, who started the Aerospace Security Project and played an important role in shaping and informing the debate on Space Force. Todd is now a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where he focuses on defense strategy and budgeting, the defense industrial base, space policy, and security. Todd, over to you.
It's a pleasure to be back here at CSIS, and a lot of familiar faces out here in the audience. And the best thing about it is I can just show up and moderate a panel. I didn't have to do anything to organize it. So kudos to Carrie and to McKenna and Clayton and the rest of the team here for putting on this all-day event. I can tell you from experience, it is a lot of work. Our panel discussion, we're going to look back at how we got to where we are, what it took to get the Space Force across the finish line, and where we're going to go in the future, where we should go in the future. I'm going to tee it off here in the discussion because, you know, the progression towards an independent service for space was not a linear progression. It didn't happen just steadily over time and then suddenly we gave birth to the Space Force. It was in fits and starts over time. And, you know, looking back in the history of it, really, you have to go back to the 1980s. That's when we saw some of the first big efforts at space reorganization within the military. 1982, you had the establishment of United States Space Command, the combatant command for space. That same year, you had a major command within the Air Force established, Air Force Space Command. So you had a lot of reorganization going on at the time. I remember looking back at the congressional record, there actually was a bill submitted in Congress to create a separate military for service in the 1980s. They would have called it the Defense Force. It would have had space and missile defense. That didn't go anywhere at the time. But people were starting to think about it even back then. You fast forward to the 1990s, you've got the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, Ron Fogelman. I remember I was a cadet in ROTC. I remember him saying, today we have an Air Force. It is becoming an air and space force, and one day it will be a space and Air Force. He was talking about the growing importance of space within the Air Force. And this is Air Force Chief of Staff saying this. In the late 1990s, the debate started to pick up and get a little more serious. You had Senator Bob Smith from New Hampshire writing articles. I think in 1998, he published a journal article talking about how we needed a space force. We needed a separate military service for space. That activity in Congress, it resulted in the creation of the Rumsfeld Commission, what became known as the Rumsfeld Commission, to study space reorganization and reform. That committee then released its final report, I think it was January of 2001. And among their recommendations, there were a lot of recommendations. Among them, it said that we should create a Space Corps, a military service for space within the Department of the Air Force. And it put it in the timeline of medium term, kind of ambiguous of what they meant by medium term. But then lo and behold, Donald Rumsfeld became Secretary of Defense. And I think a lot of people thought, like, wow, this is really going to happen. We're really on this trajectory. And then reality intervened. 9/11 happened. The nation's focus shifted. U.S. Space Command, the Combatant Command, was disestablished, put within that responsibility, put within Strategic Command, and things kind of went on the back burner in terms of space reorganization. And then I credit the Chinese. They picked this up again for everyone. The 2007 Chinese ASAT test really lit a fire, and I think it reignited the insurgency to create the Space Force. And so with that, I want to start with our first panelist here, Matt O'Kane. As I go down and introduce each of the panelists, I'm not going to tell you all the things they've done in their career because it's too lengthy. But what I am going to tell you is what job they were in at the time that all this was happening, because that gives you an idea of their perspective. So since 2010, Matt's been at the Office of Management and Budget, and in particular at the time this debate was brewing, he was overseeing all of the national security portfolio, national security space portfolio. So looking over all the different budgets and programs and activities going on in national security space. So Matt, why don't you pick it up after that ASAT test and the flurry of activity in the intel community? What did you see going on?
Sure. Well, first, I kind of want to start with thanking CSIS and for Carrie for pulling this together. This is it's a great event. It's a great day to be able to celebrate this. It's super important. And to date, we've told this story kind of via oral tradition, right? And so I'm actually happy to. I'm looking forward to someone doing the history on this justice. So going back to the Chinese. Giving them full credit for this, that the January 2017 ASAT test really crystallized a lot of support. Defense and intelligence people have been tracking this for quite some time, but for the broader community, right, the largest single debris creating event, really organized and crystallized a lot of attention on this. And unfortunately, it took place kind of towards the back end of the Bush administration. And so when they went out to get some good ideas from departments and agencies as to how to rise and to meet the threat, there just wasn't a lot of time to implement that, to build that into budget, to have that sustained commitment to really affect strategic change. Some good things kind of came out around this time. We had the space security program, which later became SSDP. But when the Obama administration came in, it kind of started, as most administrations did, it started with drafting a national space policy. And that kind of things kind of flow down as the administration starts working its way down. Over time, that developed Chirag Parikh, who should be delivering this part of the speech. He's really the best qualified to do this because he lived the intelligence piece of this in his previous role. He joined NSC in fall of 2010, same time I did. And he really worked this from, brought his background and experience. We had at the same time the space security, the National Space Security Strategy. We had the National Space Security Strategy. Then we had the Space Posture Review that came out that really started to build and give us a lot of thoughts. We had the National Intelligence Estimate. All of these things were coming together. And into the first term of the Obama administration, moving into the second term, Chirag bundled all of this up, packaged it up for President Obama, and outlined, we'd been on this path since the ASAT test with this memo that talked about the increasing threats and kind of what was in the realm of the possible to do. That started a series of 40 what we call interagency policy committee meetings. These are assistant secretary level meetings with agencies. And over the course of over a year, there are about 40 of these things. I have been at OMB for 14 years. I've been a part of dozens of IPC processes. The typical IPC process may last 5 or so. Very few would ever exceed 8 or 10. This one went 40 over a very long period of time, which tells you the level of focus that was being put on this. And it was really focused on the threat, which was excellent. And so in response to the threat, DoD typically approaches these things from the material solutions. It's really the department, one of the primary mechanisms by which the department addresses threats is through material solutions. Since the White House was convening, I think they thought that the White House was likely to pick up a substantial portion of the bills. And so we got a very thorough and well thought out list. And as Chirac and I and others in our organizations looked at these lists, we recognized, to some of the opening comments by Chairman Rogers, it was going to take 6 to 8 years or so to deliver these capabilities. And if we could snap our fingers and deliver those, we would have happily taken that deal. But we had the experience to know that it was going to take a sustained commitment over time and have the consistent attention to be able to deliver these capabilities. And we had, as much as we had saw in the aftermath of the Rumsfeld Commission, attention often shifted from crisis to crisis. So we really started looking at some structural reforms, things that could provide some guardrails to allow these investments time to mature and to deliver. We also wanted DoD ideally to deliver those, like to offer up its own suggestions as to how this could be done. If the White House did it, it was probably a lot less chance it was going to be stick or kind of be sustained over the long term. Unfortunately, and probably not a surprise to people in this audience, DoD felt it had the right organizational constructs in place. But Chirac and I were persistent, and our organizations were very supportive in allowing us to continue to ask some foundational questions. And what was, I think, most surprising was not that DoD kind of pushed back on some of these ideas that we were putting forth, but even the folks, we had some sympathizers that were attending these IPCs. And I think they even were concerned that this had the potential to take us away from delivering some of these capabilities. You know, they had seen this movie, many people had seen this movie before, we were talking about having organizational change, but it wasn't successful. And they really wanted to make sure that we got these capabilities out of the process. So at the end of the day, we are looking at our watch, we're seeing the clock tick as these meetings are going on. We were eager to kind of be able to advance the ball somewhat down the field. And so in addition to the largest, at the time, the largest single increase in national security space spending, the 2016 budget had the first ever dedicated space appropriation included. And that may not sound like a big deal, but it was the first time that we had really sequestered money out of the Air Force's budget for space purposes. And DoD also saw this as a significant event because it got litigated at the cabinet level. A new appropriation account got litigated at the cabinet level. So the next thing that kind of happens is, in a lot of ways, we put this money in the budget. We are justifying it. We are educating all of our stakeholders on the threats. And the very next cycle, when we tuned into the 2017 budget, some of that funding that we had placed in the budget had started to recede. It had been realigned to other purposes. And that was really where we were able to finally make our point and say, that's what we're talking about. This is the sustained commitment that we have been worried about that we would be able to. We need to be able to have this focused attention on this. And so that very example, the actual quote from a very senior person at the time was, "We did space last year." And so it was timely. There was some supportive language. HASC was starting to ramp up its focus on this as well. DoD started to feel kind of the pressure and to respond to some of these organizational criticisms. And so this is in the same era that we got JICSPOC, the JCITF, the Joint Space Tactics Doctrine Forum, and then we also had PDSA. And so, you know, none of those were really scratching the itch, but I think it is representative that they were starting to kind of feel the pressure. But again, the clock, we're looking at the clock, it's ticking, and we really needed to kind of start to kind of put a bow on this as the Obama administration was starting to come to an end. And so what happened next was really Chirac and Tony Blinken, who had been a huge supporter, left NSC. And what we really agreed to with DoD was to kind of kick this to a study, which we were comfortable with at the time because we thought they were going to be, that any study was going to come to similar conclusions as we had done. I wrote a transition paper on this very subject, space organization management reform. Reflecting on that, that was probably for my own way to kind of bring to closure than really expecting the new administration to pick this up. And so, but just to put a bow on this part of the chapter, and then we'll move into kind of the more exciting public debates around this. I think the value of this period of time in the Obama administration was really talking about the threats and making this a threat-focused discussion. And also, I would say, this was the first time I think people were talking about space organization management outside of like a commission. This was like a real policy environment. This was for real. This is in studies and commissions, right? You kind of have this academic feel of you have to explore the whole studio space. We were doing this in policy, which is really based in reality. And that, I think, had the benefit of really bringing down the taboo. The ideas of a Defense Space Agency from Allard Commission, from a Space Corps or Space Force, those were kind of four-letter words for a long period of time. And you say them enough and over again, and that really allows you to start to have a really substantive discussion on that. Anyway, that's kind of
all right.
Kick it back over to you.
No, that's great. Yeah, and I mean, takeaway there, you add a plus up for space. The Air Force comes back the next year. The money's gone. We did space last year. And I know folks on the Hill, we're seeing this as well. So I want to turn next to Representative Jim Cooper, Democrat from Tennessee, a Blue Dog Democrat. And if people are too young to know what that means, just Google it. But at the time, you were the ranking member of the Strategic Forces Subcommittee on the House Armed Services Committee. And tell us, what did you see from your perspective, and where did you guys pick up on the committee?
Well, first of all, be careful, y'all, because now that I'm not in Washington, I can speak plain English. I have freedom of speech, and I'm thankful for that. And any of you who want to deliver a Space Force nuggets to me, I'd be delighted to hear from you. Because, for example, Matt had a juicy quote, "We did space last year." I want to know who said that. I add the sex and the violence to the story of Space Force. But this whole
people want to watch the Netflix series, right?
Figuratively, not literally.
But I hope people understand in this room that this discussion we're having is not about the past. It's interesting, and we can discuss how sausage was made. What we're interested about is how future sausage will be made and can be made and must be made. And that will be done not by folks with lapel pins from a previous Congress or current Congress. It is done by staff. And I am so thankful to be on a panel with three of the folks who made it happen. They're not famous. They'll never be famous unless you do something really bad. But this is the way policy works. There are people in this room right now who have ideas that they are afraid to mention. And the reason Steve and Matt and Todd are on this panel now is they were brave enough to mention those ideas. Because the way Washington works is elected officials are largely the puppets. These are the ventriloquists. They give us the language, the concepts, the history, because we don't know. I was elected from 1st Rural District in Tennessee, and it's kind of near Huntsville, kind of near Tullahoma. I didn't know. But even the Rumsfeld Commission, like, what? You have to have history and context and concepts to make things happen, and staff supply those. So Maria Vastula is here. She's not on any of the panels. She did yeoman's work. Sarah's already been recognized. There's so many folks. I have a young intern right now at University of Chicago, Oliver Bunton in the back, who's helping be the new generation of this. Understand how this works, because it's got to work again. Because Mike Rogers in his remarks mentioned the Space Force might not be living up to its potential. But it's your ideas and your bravery and mentioning those ideas that can change the web. So I didn't know that the Obama administration had been so deeply involved. What Matt told you is real news. Although as a current federal employee, he had to be really careful in how he said it. What Steve did first on our subcommittee and then moving to the Pentagon was absolutely vital. I wish Doug Lavero were here, because that man risked his career for a quarter of a century to do this. And who were his enemies? Fellow Americans who just didn't quite get it. They're wonderful people, but in the Air Force construct in particular, you are a dead man or woman if you mention this. You would certainly lose your membership in the club. And I don't blame all the good folks who might have whispered to us what the right thing to do was, but they could not say it for the sake of their careers. I understand that. These are good people. But we need systems that allow good ideas to bubble to the top. Now, the House was probably the least likely place for action to be expected because all the previous great men are all senators and they're famous and they're, but like, really? Stuff can happen in the House too. In fact, you know, all revenue bills come from the House and most people here want the money, you know. Mike and I decided we're going to work together. That's rare in Washington, almost unheard of. Well, what's wrong with it? We're all on the same team, folks. Get over it. So that ability, we could make sausage together. Mike passed it in the Republican Congress. I had to pass it in the Democratic Congress. And Trump was on the wrong side both times. Because when we passed it in the House under Republican Congress, Trump was against us. He decided a year later he was for us. And then in a Democratic Congress, when his support could kill us, he was for us. So this is why bipartisanship is important. You can't predict which way the majorities are going to go. And no one can predict now with a zero majority Congress, like, oh my God. But good stuff needs to happen. And if we're not threat-based, what are we? Like, that's news or that's a novel approach. But we got to buy stuff. We got to defer to the private sector. You know, so many folks here, the government construct is deadening. And I love government. Hell, I'm a Democrat. But government's got to work better. And many of you have ideas for making the government work better that need to bubble to the top. And this actually might be a time when a number of those ideas can flourish. Because I love the private companies. They're making stuff happen. And they can work at a speed that we can only dream of.
So I want to ask you a question, though. So, you know, you and Chairman Rogers had seen the threat briefings, right? You both were energized. You decided you were going to team up and make this happen. How did you convince your colleagues, really on the House Armed Services Committee, to go along with such a radical idea at the time?
Well, believe it or not, we started with a staff retreat. Now, that's a euphemism in Washington. It really means a member education session. Because the slowest folks in the room are the members because we're distracted, you know, we don't know. And even going to the threat briefings, you know, there should have been a threat briefing on the threat from the U.S. Air Force trying to kill everything we're trying to do. You know, let's be honest. And I am not faulting the Air Force people. But Mike and I had to beg, for example, General Hyten to spend his Christmas vacation writing us a best military judgment memo on what needed to be done. Now, he never lost his membership in the Air Force Club. He's one of the great officers of all time. But he was willing to admit some flaws that need to be corrected. And we are never told about that as members. So honest dialogue is really important for policymaking. Having brave and honest staffers and knowledgeable and perceptive staffers, because they don't have graduate schools in this stuff. You got to learn it on your own. You got to dig. You got to ask questions. And we have the ability to go visit bases and learn things. But we persuaded our colleagues, because Mike and I basically have credibility. We are boring backbencher members of Congress. We're not racing you to the cameras. We're just trying to do the right thing. And we pay attention. CBS 60 Minutes did a lot of good with their 2015, the Battle Above thing. Dave Martin did it. That helped. Because in our media world, if you don't have media awareness on your side, if you don't have pictures, and you don't even have to have the sex and violence, but you got to get people's attention. And Mike and I were able to do that. We passed it almost unanimously on the first try. Because we were right, and we had the facts, and we knew our stuff.
All right, Steve, I want to get you into the conversation here. So, Steve, around this time, you, at the beginning of this debate, you were a professional staff member on the Strategic Forces Subcommittee. And then 2017, you crossed the Potomac, you went to the executive branch, and you became the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Space Policy. So you were on both sides during this debate. Tell us, some of your reflections on what it took.
Well, thank you, Todd. It's terrific to be here. What a wonderful event. It is a bit surreal, 5 years later from the creation, but the story really does go back much further, as you're hearing. And I know Mr. Cooper is giving a lot of credit to staff, and there is terrific staff in the room here watching, not watching, people like Audrey Schaefer right up in front here. There's too many to name who've been part of this, but I do say thank you, and you all know who you are. But the members are the ones who are actually having the authority, and they're the ones who are elected by the American people. So when they're putting these ideas out there, Mr. Cooper, Chairman Rogers, President Trump, it's them who's putting their credibility on the line. It's them who are going to be voted by the American people, who may have said, that's a horrible idea, and get voted out of Congress, but and that doesn't happen in the staff. So the point is, I give a lot of credit to these individuals who made it happen, along with members on the Senate as well. There's a couple things that I think are so key and instructive to how this came about during that time period. One is the bipartisan nature that it happened, where it was really both sides of the aisle that were working together, and I think that's so important. And the American people don't see that often, but there's great Americans that are working together at the member level, at the staff level, to make things like this happen. The second thing is, this never started with a solution in mind. There's a quote that Einstein supposedly gave where he said, if the world was going to end in an hour, I'm going to spend 55 minutes on the problem and 5 minutes on the solution. And that's exactly what we did as part of this oversight. And that was happening both in the Pentagon, in the executive office of the president, as well as in Congress on both sides of Capitol Hill. And, Matt talked about 40 interagency planning committees that were happening. At that time, there was over 40 meetings happening with Congressman Rogers and Congressman Cooper, myself, Leonor Tamaro, Tim Morrison, with all sorts of people. Now, I actually recently found my notes for that period, so we're going to have to see how much of that should be shared. One of them I am going to share, and Mr. Rogers talked about his speech in 2017, and he talked about the promotion statistics of the Air Force promoting colonels to one-star general. I think it was 37 people, and none being career space professionals. And supposedly later we found out there was one, but that's kind of besides the point, or only further exemplifies the point. Now, where did we get that? Steve Kitay was helping, Steve Kitay and Tim Morrison were helping Congressman Rogers on that speech, which we worked really hard on, and that was a culmination of years of work. But we always needed that good opening, and that statistic provided the opening. And I remember General Raymond was there in the room, and you could hear a mic drop after he gave that in the beginning. So that came from a one-star general that I met with at the time. It was called Sinead's, an Irish bar outside the Pentagon on a Friday afternoon, and that information, it was open to the public. The promotion statistics go to the Senate, and and anybody could look it up, but I wasn't, as a staffer, diligent enough of looking at every promotion statistic, so I needed a little bit of a nudge. That nudge came from then Brigadier General Chance Saltzman, who also shared what the future needs to look like. And it wasn't that he was in any way going behind the back of leadership chain or anything like that in the Pentagon or the executive branch, but what he was doing was sharing original thinking and what the future needs to be. And I think, when we talk about the future of the Space Force, original thinking is at the core of it.
Yeah, no, that's a great nugget, that there were a lot of people working different ways behind the scenes. Now, 2017, you guys put the legislative language into the NDAA. It passed the full House. So the House version of the NDAA would have created a Space Corps, it was called at the time. The Senate didn't engage. I think it's just, plain to say that Senate just, wasn't engaged on this issue at all at that point. The final version of the NDAA that year did not have it in there. But in the meantime, when it was in the House version, it was still pending, you had the Secretary of Defense, Mattis, come out against it. You had the Secretary of the Air Force, Heather Wilson, come out against it. We had a statement of administration policy from the Trump administration. Now, Matt, you were involved in that. That was a little softer, right? So what went on there?
Yeah, so this is interesting, right? So the Space Corps from the HASC came out in the spring of 2017, and what the executive branch does after that, right? We issue what's called a statement of administration policy, or a SAP, and that's a process that OMB owns, and we take inputs obviously from departments and agencies on the various provisions of the pending legislation. So in this case, we received a largely overwhelmingly critical input from the Department of Defense as to what they thought should be the content of the statement of administration policy. This is at a time, though, before Space Council has been stood up. Scott Pace hasn't yet joined the administration. There really isn't a dedicated space policy-making organization. So we had to run an abbreviated policy process as to how to approach this. I mean, I am personally sympathetic to it, right? This is something that I've worked on for a number of years, but that means absolutely nothing, right? To Steve's point, the elected officials and the political appointees get to make those decisions. And so to I think, great credit to Rob Blair and Russ Vought, ran a very adjudicated process and negotiated language that I saw. It was certainly a far departure from what we had received from the Department of Defense. And I wrote a few quotes because it could have gone quite differently. The administration appreciates the committee's concerns with the organization and management of DoD's space capabilities. The administration looks forward to working with Congress to implement military space organizational changes. The administration is assessing a wide range of options, including a Space Corps. So 6 months into an administration, without kind of a deliberate policy process to discuss these things, the Trump administration documents that it is looking at options, including a Space Corps itself. And so I thought this could have gone very differently. As a matter of fact, I think had we included the DoD language, I'm not sure that, I think the Space Corps, Space Force gets kicked a few more years down the road, but I think that left the door ajar. It certainly did not slam it, I think, on the legislation's face. Please.
I wish Senator Tom Cotton had read the SAP. He got passed in the Senate NDAA a provision banning anything that could be called a Space Corps from ever forming. Now, senators are not as diligent as some other folks, don't get into the details, so nothing was passed called a Space Force, but we won everything else in that conference committee report, and staff did that. It was partly our support from the Big Four, and so far we haven't mentioned the support of Mac Thornberry and Adam Smith, who gave us top cover, because we started with ideas, complaints, worries, how to fix stuff. When we ended up with legislative language, we never introduced an independent bill. It was included in the chairman's mark from the start, giving us a home court advantage, which is huge. Why introduce a bill if you don't have to? That just gives your enemies something to shoot at. And the Air Force could have taken us down just with that, because I love SAPs, and sometimes I read them. But what matters to members is whether your Air Force back home is for you or against you. And with Mad Dog Mattis giving them top cover and Heather Wilson, you know, nobody, they knew they were against us. Mike Turner, God bless him, I just saw him this morning. Great guy. He represents Wright Pat Air Force Base. Which side was he going to be on? But see, most members are like that. I went begging Senator Bill Nelson to help us, former astronaut. You know, it's like, but I think there's 7 Air Force facilities in Florida or something like that. They have no choice. So see, when it gets down to political reality, you got to go where your people are. And I respect that. Life is about self-interest, but sometimes there's a greater good. And that's where your good ideas come in.
And so, you know, I remember, I'll share one of my recollections. So it was the summer of 2017 when this was really getting debated a lot in different circles. I got pulled into a group, and it's been, you know, more than 5 years, so I can name names now. Doug Lavero, Steve Jakes, Mark Berkowitz, we're talking about this and how to get this through, how to get this done. They pulled me in, and they had the idea of, why don't we do an all-day conference at CSIS? And I said, that's actually a great idea. And we did. It was September of 2017, I think, right here on this stage. And we had a variety of people, different perspectives come in. I think you were there. Mr. Rogers was there, others. No one from the Air Force would attend, even though we invited. We tried to get you guys. Would not. Public Affairs wouldn't allow it. But we had lots of people, retired, you know, space generals, everything. And we spent the whole day discussing different organizational ideas for space, not just a Space Corps or Space Force, but a combatant command, you know, some sort of a separate acquisition agency. And years later, then it was kind of funny to look back that all the options we discussed, actually what the country selected was all of the above. We got the Space Development Agency as a separate acquisition organization that wasn't part of the Air Force in the beginning. We got a combatant command reestablished for space, and got the service. But yeah, you know, you had that big discussion going on in these different fora. And then the conference calls continued among the small group. I'm looking at Steve there. And trying to figure out how to get this through. And a lot of it, you know, for those of us on the outside, was trying to figure out who are the obstacles, who are the impediments that are getting in the way, and how can we neutralize them? And so, you know, there was a lot going on in the background as well that helped push us forward. Steve.
Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to add, you know, for me, going from the House then to the Pentagon in 2017, you know, as has been mentioned, it's certainly no secret that, you know, to say that the Space Force or the Space Corps was unpopular at that time is probably an understatement. But I also, you know, reflect, you know, looking at the leaders at that time, who it's fairly new in the administration, and you know, think about if you were that leader that's elected, appointed, and you're being asked to do something that hasn't been done in our nation in over 70 years. You're probably not going to say, sure, let's go ahead with it, you know, after a briefing or two. Or because a member of Congress said, let's do it. You're going to dig into it. And I remember Secretary Mattis, Deputy Secretary Shanahan, really trying to understand what the problems are. Everybody did come back to the threats, as Matt started this discussion with, and those threats really started ramping up in 2014, and it were continuing to accelerate. And what do we do about that? Now, I would say, so there was a lot of studies that were happening in the Pentagon, a lot of, great people across the enterprise looking at different ways to do this. And, a sea change moment was in 2018 at a National Space Council meeting. I remember sitting there. The main topic was space traffic management, where a policy was going to be signed, but President Trump went and opened that meeting. And I remember, seeing him speak, and there was a teleprompter there, and he spoke very clearly that he is hereby directing the Pentagon to begin the process to establish the Space Force as a sixth branch of the armed forces. And that was a huge moment. The President of the United States giving the direction for the Pentagon to begin that process. Now, it's very clear, too, he didn't say go stand it up, because the President did not have the authority to create a sixth branch of the armed forces. That authority rested with Congress. So, at that point, it was still a lot of debate, discussion, the right way to do it. I'll never forget, Audrey Schaefer mentioning, who's in my office in space policy, Steve, every boss I have between you and the President of the United States has a different vision of what this actually looks like, which is true, because now we kind of all look at it and, kind of figure, well, this was always what everybody thought, but there were a lot of different ideas. Do you do a department of the Space Force? Do you do it within the Space Corps model? Do you do a SOCOM model? Do you do an agency-like activity? Do you include the intelligence community or not? And it is interesting that the more study that happened, the more clear it became really to everybody.
Matt, I want to pick up on you here. So in 2018, I think it was March of 2018, when President Trump first publicly floated the idea of a Space Force. Did you see that coming? You were in the White House.
So we had a little bit of tactical warning on this, and I'm going to be careful how I speak to this. There was a cabinet meeting a few days prior to that, and for somebody to FOIA kind of the discussions that occurred there, but Scott Pace did give everybody a warning that we had not heard the last of a particular topic that may be the subject here today. So that had been discussed in private just prior.
Yeah. All right. I want to, Congressman Cooper, did you have anything else you wanted to add before I move on?
CSIS deserves great credit for giving us credibility. Brookings was not for us. AEI was not for us. We needed respectable people. Hamry actually played a more questionable role. He was working both sides. Somebody FOIA'd these emails, and they've been released. And he was, helpful but neutral. But Todd was a hero in this, as was Steve and Mark, folks like that. We've left out so far completely the RD 180 issue. That's what destroyed Air Force credibility in this debate. Because here we were relying on Russian missiles to launch most everything. And that was, in fact, the most effective ASAT weapon in the world if any of those missiles had ever failed. Now, they turned out to be reliable, but the supply was also questionable, especially after Crimea. And John McCain had a field day with these hearings. And there were explosive Senate debates on this. So that was a fundamental crack in the Air Force armor, without which we could never have passed Space Force or Space Corps, and then it turned into Space Force. But Mike and I are very proud that pretty much our original concept survived to the end. Now, it was called Force instead of Corps, but that was crucial. But you are hearing more of the real truth in this panel than has ever been released before. Because in our piecemeal, hectic lives, we get snippets of this and that. And it's not been put together. And to me, it's an interesting story, not because of what happened, but because of what you need to be doing to fix things in the future. Because this can be done.
So I want to ask each of you then, here we are 5 years into the Space Force. What has surprised you about where we are now? Would you have, is it different than what you expected it would be after 5 years? Or is it much in line with what you expected? So I don't know who wants to.
Oh, forgive me. I'm disappointed, let's be honest, because the threats are only mounting. Many people are doing yeoman work. Frank Calvelli are doing the best you possibly can in our ancient, leaden, hidebound framework. Like, who really cares if we haven't done it for 72 years? That's not even an argument in the private sector. It's like, we need to move fast and break things. And that mentality is just alien. And I'm not faulting anyone. I'm thankful for those of you who put on the government uniform, that straitjacket, and worn it successfully for years. But there is a freedom out there that you need to be embracing. Because in World War II, we could get stuff done. We need to do that again. And Palmer Luckey, among other people, has been celebrating that. Now, a lot of these are wild and crazy people, and they don't fit in the government mold. But I have a Starlink dish on my farm, and it works great. And I'm thankful for them supplying it in Ukraine. And I'm thankful for their existing. But the Air Force certification process for SpaceX was outrageous. Something that the Air Force never could have passed when they were getting started. And by the way, where were the Billy Mitchells in this debate? Now, he was a unique character, often misunderstood, but we should not pay homage to the past without living up to the examples that, we pretend to admire. So I don't want to get into all the details of it. Jay Raymond deserves incredible credit for being the first one to take all the bullets, because all the silly stuff people care most about, the uniform, the song, it's like, what I care about is the technology and whether we're beating China and Russia. And I hope the latest Google quantum development is correct, but so often we do their research for them because they've stolen it before we can get it off the drawing board. There are so many things that we're just not even aware of their capabilities, and they are mounting. And it would really take an extraordinary effort, because no more do we need 6 to 10 year procurements. We need tomorrow. We need all night. If you look at Kelly Johnson, the development of the U-2 and the SR-71 Jet Blackbird, it's incredible. A skunk works, I think, within Lockheed that happened. Lockheed didn't know about it, but it happened. And we need people who are engineers and actually understand this stuff, not just manage folks. So there are wonderful works on the change in Air Force culture over time, because Benny Schriever was actually a smart guy who knew stuff. He wasn't just telling people who were smart what to do. So getting back to that ethic of capability is the fundamental. Chance Saltzman's doing the best job that any human being can do to pull it in that direction. And God bless him. And God bless him and some other generals who probably don't want to be named yet until Steve outed them, for having helped educate the staff that educated us. Because they were afraid to be seen with us. Many of them had to be dressed in civilian clothes when they talked. Some of them may have used Signal or WhatsApp, I don't know. But, it's like, this is, without information, we are dead. And the American people right now are suffering from a dearth of information because they barely understand their dependence. One of my chief worries, we used to joke about that in the SCIF all the time, and I love the cloud, and I'm on the cloud, but does the cloud mean the Chinese love our uploaded data? If that's true, we put all the eggs in one basket, and none of us that I've ever met are smart enough to guard the basket. And watch out. Because my car works on a computer, my bank account's on a computer, my movies are on a computer. And it's like, and one of the main guys promising that they're going to protect our data can't launch a rocket. Like, whoa. And by the way, only about 12 people in the history of humans have ever been able to launch a rocket. And we need to do everything possible to protect and value those people. because if you can't do it, don't criticize them.
So Steve.
One slide aside, as the person from Microsoft that's here, we do have very secure cloud capabilities that are at secret and top secret.
Yeah, but you're not trying to launch a rocket, I know.
We're not trying to launch a rocket. One point on what has surprised me, this is less about the Space Force in particular, but about the domain, and Chairman Rogers spoke a bit about this. Previously is the rapid acceleration. And you just think about, that hockey stick curve that we are all part of on activity in space and how much that has grown. I also find it, and we were talking about this in the back, looking at, publicly there's been discussion of the valuation of SpaceX, and I know Gwen Shotwell is going to be here later, so maybe this is a question Carrie can ask her, but SpaceX, a space company, rocket launches, satellites. I believe the public reports talked about like $350 billion. And you look at the top, 3 defense contractors and add them up, and they're probably still not quite at 350 billion, and that's one space company. So the point I'm trying to make is the opportunity in this domain is tremendous. And I think that's so incredibly exciting. If I look at, the Space Force and where it's come over 5 years, certainly we need to move faster to address the threats. But the work that General Raymond, General Saltzman, a whole team of people, I see General Chess here, have done is absolutely incredible. And I think that, one of the most things I'm proud of for them, and when I see, and I'm really happy about, is the amount of young people that are excited about joining that service. And it's a proud service, and it's very early in its days, but the impact it's going to make with this relatively small but mighty team is absolutely incredible. So, I want to take a moment, and I know we have multiple Guardians in the room here, both uniformed and civilian, and just thank them.
Matt?
No, I was just going to say, I think everyone acknowledges that there's room for improvement and for where Space Force is. I am personally happy that we did this proactively. I think had we waited until we had a Pearl Harbor in space and then we had to, due to political forces, kludge a bunch of disparate organizations together, I think it would actually take longer to get to kind of a full sprint. But, my more personal experience was 25 years ago, I was at Schriever Air Force Base as a young officer, and I have been back over years as part of my responsibilities, and I was back this summer most recently and went around to units that I used to work in or folks that I worked with, and I see the cultural change. Obviously, I think there is more to go, but I really do see people that are motivated. Every briefing that we got was threat focused. We have, I think, come quite a long ways from where we were a few years ago. I agree that we've got now have to pick up the pace and go faster. But I think it's also worth acknowledging, how far we've come because, there are things that are important. You do need rank and you need people. And on day one of the Space Force, General Raymond didn't have people for him. It actually took us 3 budget cycles, to actually have a dedicated appropriation for Space Force personnel. So that's not on the Space Force. It takes the bureaucracy to also support the Space Force, give it the resources it needs to be successful and to help it along the way.
Yeah, no, I mean, I would add in terms of kind of my expectations, like I have been a little disappointed how slow some things have gone. Very disappointed in the uniform, sorry. But there's been a lot, to be optimistic about, especially the way that we've seen acquisition programs, I think, start to turn the corner. especially what we're seeing with the Space Development Agency launching a proliferated constellation. I'm excited to see Tranche 1 launch, hopefully within a few months here. But yeah, so I mean, I think that there have been those growing pains along the way. But, you know, looking forward now, Chairman Rogers, you know, he brought up the subject of a separate department of the Space Force. So moving it from a service that's under the Department of the Air Force to its own department, own military department. And maybe you bring intel into that, maybe you don't. You know, I don't want to, Matt, I know you're still in government. I'm going to ask your opinion on it. But, you know, the other folks here, you know, what do you think the odds are? Do you think it's a good decision? And Chairman Rogers, he said not yet, but leaving the door open that maybe in the future. What are your thoughts?
Well, the department gives you the greatest flexibility, but also burdens you with real overhead. Now, satellites are good overhead. The administrative stuff. But see, we need to be solving that for all agencies in government anyway, because a lot of our old systems are not working. Our international rivals, you know, President Xi says something. Do you think he's going to wait 18 months before something happens? That's what Trump had to do after he commanded in the White House there was going to be a Space Force. And see, we take that 18-month lag for granted. Oh, that's called normal in our country. We can't have that as normal anymore. Now, Matt's exactly right. This was a miracle that Space Force is one of the few things stood up before the crisis. If you look at Special Forces Command, we'd already had the Beirut barracks bombing. We'd had other horrific international incidents that displayed our incredible incompetence. And then we did something. We have been proactive, but we've got to push it to the limits, because it's Mr. Littfoot said, this is a digital age. We all need to be digital natives. We can't survive a minute without space. And our GPS satellites are incredibly vulnerable. So we've got to get with the program here. Frank's doing a wonderful job trying to proliferate the architecture so that we have real resilience. But, you know, there are career officers who spent lifetimes trying to get this, and it's still barely happening. So we got a lot of work to do, folks. Nobody should be patting themselves on the back. We used to be preeminent. Our margin is slipping if we're not outright behind. And there's so many people who don't have the skills to get ahead. Because, see, we major in sports management these days. We don't major in engineering. You know, we don't want to know how stuff works, most people. And, you know, if I see another political science major, I think I'm going to throw up, because you know, it's like, what do you know? You know, show me how you can get elected, or show you that you really know civics. But, you know, polling, oh great, that's very effective. Yeah. So I just want reality here, and I want America to be number one and have no close competitor. And we're not doing that right now, because our competitors are nipping at our heels. Where's our hypersonic capability? We led the world in the 70s, and we kind of forgot about it. You know, the dip that we had as we killed our own capabilities, as we assumed space was a sanctuary, is deadening. And Secretary of the Air Force, Heather Wilson, said without embarrassment, the Air Force built a glass house in space before the invention of stones. No Secretary of the Air Force should ever have to admit that.
Steve, any thoughts?
Well, I think on the Department of the Space Force, yet is the right word. I think it becomes a question of timing. And the Space Policy Directive in the Trump administration did include a line in there that, you know, that should be something that's continually studied, and when the conditions are right, that the Secretary of Defense should look to make that recommendation forward. So, you know, I don't have a strong opinion on it being now. I think that probably there is going to be a time in our lives where people truly are living and working in space. And I know we have the International Space Station, exploration is happening there, but I mean beyond that. And as we get towards that, you can imagine the role of the Space Force needing to expand even more. You know, I guess the last thing I would mention when we do look at the Space Force and what it, I think, does need to be really building up and focusing on is that second mission that Congressman Rogers mentioned when he said that really the Space Force has two missions, one to enable the joint force, which is critically important, and that was a mission that really came over from the Air Force, and the second one is to protect and defend our interests in space. And that is going to be even more of a set of capabilities, doctrine, training, readiness that the Space Force needs to embrace and develop.
Well, that brings up one of the questions here from the audience is, you know, when are we going to shift our focus more to being willing to talk about offensive space, counter space capabilities? I think we're seeing a little bit in, you know, some of the, you know, vision documents coming out of the Space Force, you know, more recently. But, you know, General Saltzman talked about counter space campaigning, right? Actually doing this stuff in peacetime, showing others that we can hold their space assets at risk. We're not seeing that yet, not openly. And, you know, if it's in secret and your adversary doesn't know about it, it doesn't do a lot to deter them if they don't know what we're capable of doing. Do you guys see movement in that area that maybe we will actually become a little more open about the ability to hold other nations' space assets at risk?
Well, with Salt Typhoon and Flax Typhoon and things like that, you think they don't know? Like, give me a break. I think their J-20 was built about as quickly as our F-35 was built. And we spent, I think, according to Christina Chaplin, $350 billion on the F-35. According to the fanciest submarine is $108 billion total program cost. So we have fundamental problems that we have to overcome. Let's be real. We're talking Pentagon here. We're talking real fighting. You have to. What football team only has defense? Can you remind me? It's like you have to have a passing game. You have to have an offense. And see, the communication problem isn't with the enemy. They know our capabilities better sometimes than we do. Our communications problems is with the American people, because some of them think we live in a Pollyanna world in which we don't have to worry about this stuff, and if we even talk about it, that makes us belligerent. That is wrong. Deterrence doesn't work that way. We have to be ultimately prepared, completely prepared, overwhelmingly prepared, and be proud of that. Now, ideally, you don't have to ever fight a battle. Sun Tzu started that, 4,000 years ago. But without preparation, you're inviting a man in the high castle scenario, and we don't want that. Thank God we had the atom bomb first, but we failed otherwise. Germans exceeded us in rocketry. The Air Force has been so paranoid since the Eisenhower years of being called militarizers of space. And the truth is that space has been militarized from the start. It hasn't been weaponized much. But we started the ASAT capability. We stopped in 1985. Thank you, President Clinton. But also, we just kind of gave up, and we didn't have much threat. The Soviet Union had collapsed. So we need to remember our own history and get our game back. And we can do that. We are doing that with Space Force. But we need to knock down some barriers.
Yeah, I agree very much with Mr. Cooper, and
you can call me Jim, by the way.
Jim, that's old habits die hard. But we do have a Space Force, and the Space Force needs to be able to protect and defend our interests in space. And General Saltzman has talked about the need to have responsible counter space campaigning. He's going to be up here, although General Raymond just stepped out. I think he's going to do it. That is a question. What does that look like? And the U.S. needs to lead the world because we don't want space to become, it is a very different domain, and we don't want it to become this big debris field that isn't usable for anybody. So I think this is something that, you know, the new administration coming in should really be looking at, is how the Space Force needs to grow, what capabilities they need to have, and how are we talking about those capabilities with the American people.
Yeah. I want to tee up another question here from the audience. What has been a politically controversial issue, although the NDAA that may pass the Senate today may put this to rest, but the creation of a Space National Guard. You know, what are each of your thoughts on that? Do we need a separate, you know, branch of the National Guard for space that would mirror kind of the structure of the Air Force? Or, you know, it's what the Space Force proposed and looks like they're going to get in the NDAA, keeping one single component of full-time and part-time Guardians. Is that a better solution? Thoughts on this?
Well, aren't we using the old language? We need the best talent in America to be accessible to the Space Force now. And I don't care whether you're called Guard, civilian, all these other little categories. We need your brains, we need your energy, we need your money. And anything it takes to get that, do it. Now, it's no secret in Congress, the Guard has always been especially favored by congressmen because they're local presidents back home. And I love that. Our weekend warriors are fabulous, and oftentimes they're more capable even than some active duty troops. So I have nothing against that. But we need to start measuring in technology and capability, whether it's hardware or software. And right now, we're not tapping into that because some people who are brilliant programmers might have too many rings in their nose or too many tattoos or weird haircuts and not want to be conventional, work all night, work remote. We need to, if they have brain power, we need it. So we need to knock down all that stuff. And one of the biggest barriers now for recruitment is it's a freestyle world. It took me forever to learn how not to wear a tie. You know, but you can do that, man. And it's all about talent. And we do not honor talent anymore in America. We do not honor expertise. We do not honor brilliance. And some of the craziest people in the world are brilliant. And we need to be thankful for that.
Other thoughts?
Steve?
I like the way Mr. Jim
Jimbo, Jim Bob.
articulated it. You know, that's an issue that now I'm kind of 4 years removed from the policy debates of that. Historically, or not historically, you know, previously that was something that really wasn't a priority of standing up a separate guard. Because do the states need their own individual space forces? I think arguments, you know, are being made that those enabling capabilities and how you integrate that in, like remote sensing or other capabilities. So I'm a little bit removed from it to have a strong opinion. I would say that the people and the capabilities, as Jim were saying, are critical. So it just becomes a question of what the right structure is. But,
yeah, one of the things I'm encouraged about is if you think, you know, what's happening with the, you know, transformation of the people in the Space Force, it'll only be a few years now before the majority of Guardians were born Guardians, right? That they only have served in the Space Force. They did not transfer from another service. And that's kind of cool to think about, that it doesn't take that many years because, you know, there's a turnover rate and, you know, junior enlisted and junior officers, but we're almost at that point that it'll be majority have been Guardians their whole career. It's going to be a different era, right?
And you know, going back to, since we're talking about the Space Force's future, I think one of the benefits of having the Space Force, right, is it gets to determine its own destiny, right? The Space Force had a chance to form and then assess kind of how it wanted to manage its people. And it took a couple of years to have the Space Force Personnel Management Act enacted, you know, and that really approached kind of how military personnel were managed in a completely different way, a way that it had not been done. But I think this is why there's an expectation that the Space Force is going to accelerate, because now a lot of these foundational enabling capabilities, like the Space Force has been given a lot of the tools it needs, and now I think we're looking forward to it, moving out and delivering the capability that the nation needs.
Yeah, and I mean, that's a great point too, that the Space Force is given, Congress is giving it different authorities, right? And, I think that that's a lesson for folks in the Space Force, especially in the current leadership team, that you're pushing on an open door. That a lot of the things that they think might be hard to get through Congress, it would be hard for the Air Force, it might be hard for the Navy. It's not going to be as hard for the Space Force, that Congress is much more willing, they've shown, that they're much more willing to let the Space Force have more latitude, have different authorities. I think that's really encouraging, but that moment won't last forever, right? And so you got to take advantage of it now and really rethink the personnel system, the readiness system, the whole structure, within the Space Force. It does not have to fit the mold of the other services, and in many cases, it should not, because it's so small, because its mission is so different, because it, deploys in place. There's so many things that are fundamentally different about the Space Force that got to embrace that uniqueness, I think, in the future. Other thoughts on the panel here?
I think one thing that holds back any of the services are their own veterans, their own alumni. Because when that becomes your primary audience during the year, and you're there to offer them more squadrons or more ships or more whatever that they want to hear, because by definition, they're old school, old guard, that holds you back. Because the officers I run into are more afraid of a press conference than they are of anything else, maybe even than the enemy, because their career's at stake if they make a misstep. And that's not right, because people are going to make mistakes. But to just have, I'm particularly worried about the Air Force, and now it's called the Air Force and Space Association, but it's the National Security Space Association that was with us all along. The crazy stuff they want their speakers to tell them is like, oh my God. Because see, they live rank and rules and stuff, and a lot of that doesn't work anymore. And we may be living in a world in which every capital ship is obsolete. Everything that doesn't move at the speed of light, or at least at the speed of sound, is dead, killed. The Pentagon has led a contract to consider using Starship to move troops anywhere in the world in 90 minutes. People. Now, that's kind of wild, but if you can carry 165 tons, but already the rocket capability, almost every city in the world is threatened, because we do not have broad defenses in America. We have point defense, at best. So we are not getting our own thinking up to speed about what's happening that we're reading in the paper every day in the Middle East, in Ukraine. Just the drone threat is people in New Jersey apparently were thinking about it. But we're not organized as a society, and we pride ourselves on our disorganization. And that was good enough in an old age. It may not be good enough today.
All right, one final question, just real quick. Is there anyone who should get credit for helping create the Space Force that the history books should know about that might not have been mentioned yet? Any other names that come up?
You go first.
Go ahead.
So, actually, I'm going to put this away. There is a huge list of names that were not mentioned today. And it's do I start now saying those names and then risk missing some of them?
Go ahead.
I mean, I guess, what I would start with is the creation of the Space Force took both sides of the Potomac. It took the Pentagon and it took the White House. It took both sides of Pennsylvania Avenue. It took the White House and it took Congress. It took both sides of Capitol Hill, where you had the House of Representatives, and we didn't talk too much about the Senate tonight, but of course we could have never done this without the Senate. It took both sides of the political aisle, and it took people that are out in industry. We talked about experts that wrote a letter to support it, to actually validate this effort. So there's many people in each one of those that were part of it, from the highest levels that often do get the news to people that often won't be recognized. People like Audrey Schaefer, Madeline Milzewski, Casey Beard, that were in the policy office working on these things. So Justin Johnson is another in the Deputy Secretary's office. So I guess I offer that, for those who know you had a contribution, one, you can reach out to Jim, but share your contributions, share the pictures, share the stories, because we were all part of the Space Force creation. And 20, 30 years from now, we'll be retired, or the second lieutenant that's here is going to be the general or chief of space operations, and these stories are all that's going to be left of the creation. So my point is to share it, share your involvement, share what happened. It is a proud history, and I'm very grateful to have been part of it.
We are out of time, so we're going to leave it at that. Last word. Join me, please, in thanking this panel. I don't see Carrie up here. Here she is. Oh, no, not Carrie.
I'll go get her.